Good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here tonight. For those of us who work day in and day out protecting and supporting refugees, seeing the incredible energy and eagerness to welcome refugees into Westchester County is so uplifting, and it's what gives all of us the strength and determination to carry on, even in what is bound to be a very challenging period. Permit me tonight to share some thoughts with you about why I think caring for refugees is a deep expression of Jewish values. Please understand that in no way do I mean to suggest that these are uniquely Jewish values. I believe every faith tradition shares these ideas. But I am here tonight to speak on behalf of HIAS, the Jewish organization committed to refugees, and for myself, a Jewish American who finds inspiration in my tradition. It's relatively well known that the commandment that the rabbi mentioned already this evening is the most repeated commandment in the Jewish Torah, in the Bible. Over and over again, in many different contexts, the Torah exhorts us to protect the stranger. And indeed, if that were the only reason to argue that caring for refugees, who are, after all, the ultimate strangers, is an important Jewish value, that would be enough. But what makes the refugee story such a Jewish concern is that the refugee story is our story, indeed our foundational story. Going back to our oppression in and exodus from Egypt, and through millennia of Jewish history, the Jewish experience has been one of persecution and flight, of hoping for refuge in some new country, and trying to rebuild life in a strange place. It is as if the experience of being a refugee, as the rabbi said, so it must be true, is written into the very DNA of the Jewish people. I would venture to say that there is no other people on the planet who feels the plight of refugees so deeply in their bones. At the same time, we American Jews now find ourselves the most secure, the wealthiest, and the most politically connected Jewish community, perhaps in all of Jewish history. So the question for us is, what do we do with that power? I am here tonight to suggest that we take 5,000 years of experience and a couple of generations of American experience and do all we can to ensure that today's refugees find the protection and welcome that was so often denied to us. Permit me now to say a few words about HIAS, because I think HIAS's history and current work exemplifies what I'm trying to say. HIAS, which some of you may remember as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, was founded in 1881 to help rescue and resettle Jewish refugees escaping the pogroms of Tsarist Russia. For the ensuing 120 years, the history of HIAS was bound up with all of the major world events and the Jews displaced by those events. The aftermath of World War I, the rise of Nazi Germany, and the aftermath of World War II, the expulsion of Jews from Arab countries, the rise of Castro's Cuba, the fall of the Shah of Iran, and of course, repression in the Soviet Union. All in all, throughout the first 120 years of HIAS's existence, we helped rescue and resettle 4.5 million Jewish refugees. At the turn of this century, as the last Jews from the former Soviet Union trickled into the United States, HIAS could have easily stated, mission accomplished, and closed up shop. But instead, we took 120 years of knowledge, expertise, and connections and turned our focus to the millions of today's refugees who find themselves fleeing their persecutors. From those humble beginnings in 1881, HIAS and we're now known only by our acronym, HIAS has grown into one of the world's largest and most important refugee protection and resettlement agencies, working with refugees regardless of religious, national, or ethnic origins. We have operations in 11 countries around the world, and we help resettle thousands of refugees each year right here in the United States. So while it is true that our clients are now overwhelmingly not Jewish, we remain true to the Jewish values, vision, and experiences of our founders. As our CEO, Mark Hetfield, likes to say, we used to help refugees because they were Jewish. Now we help refugees because we are Jewish. But there's even more in modern history that connects Jews to the refugee issue. Do you know how and why the world came to recognize the international legal concept of refugee in the first place? In the aftermath of World War II, in direct response to the horror of Jews not being able to find safe havens when they had to flee the Nazis, and even more horrifically, being forced to return to the very countries where they were being persecuted, the nations of the world codified the concept of refugee. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then in the 1951 Refugee Convention, the nations of the world committed themselves to recognize as refugees anyone persecuted for their religion, ethnicity, nationality, political views, or membership in a particular social group. And more importantly, they committed themselves to never send refugees back to the country of their persecution, but rather to find permanent, durable solutions for refugees. What does that mean? One option is to be repatriated, that is, to return to one's country when the persecution has stopped. But sadly, given the nature of most of the conflicts in the world today, this is not an option. The second possibility is to rebuild one's life in the country of first refuge, the country that one fled to. And the third possibility is to be resettled in a third, welcoming country. This option, however, is open to less than 1% of all refugees. There simply are not enough slots available worldwide for any more. And because of this, only the most vulnerable refugees, victims of torture, orphans and vulnerable children, women who suddenly find themselves as sole heads of household, people with severe medical conditions, only these refugees will even be considered for resettlement. And let me just say a few words about those refugees who are lucky enough to make it into the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. Contrary to the misinformation that has been spreading in this country for the past 15 months, admission to this country through the U.S. Refugee Program remains by far the hardest way to enter this country. Despite what some members of the emerging new administration have been saying, we do know exactly who these people are. And we at HIAS would argue that we already have extreme vetting. Before they ever set foot in America, every refugee under consideration for resettlement in the United States must undergo a rigorous multi-layered screening process, including extensive vetting by the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, the State Department, the FBI, and the Department of Defense. In fact, not only are refugees in this country not a threat, we have seen over and over again that aside from being the right thing to do, welcoming refugees into our country is good for America. From Sergey Brin, the founder of Google, to former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, to millions of not-so-famous people, refugees have made immeasurable contributions to the social, political, and economic strength of our country. In the last governmental fiscal year, which ended on September 30th, the United States brought in over 10,000 Syrian refugees to America as part of the overall program, which brought 85,000 refugees to safety. This showed that the Refugee Resettlement Program could successfully give the world's most vulnerable people a chance to live with dignity again. And yet, that effort fell far short in terms of the global leadership the United States should have been exercising. And now, at a time when the number of refugees around the world is at an all-time high, when we should be redoubling our efforts and committing to supporting even more refugees, we are facing the possibility of an administration that will severely curtail the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. On top of this, at the local and state level, far too many mayors and governors are turning their backs on America's long and proud tradition of creating warm and welcoming communities for refugees. As Jews, we remember far too well what it is to flee one's home only to be feared, loathed, and rejected from these shores. In July 1938, Americans were asked, "What is your attitude towards allowing German, Austrian, and other political refugees to come into the United States?" Fewer than 5% of Americans surveyed believed that the United States should raise its immigration quotas or encourage political refugees fleeing fascist states in Europe, the vast majority of whom obviously were Jewish, to voyage across the Atlantic. 2/3 of the respondents agreed that we should try to keep them out. Then again, in January 1939, just 2 months after the events of Kristallnacht, the following question was asked of Americans. Should the U.S. government permit 10,000 mostly Jewish refugee children to come in from Germany? Fully 2/3 of the respondents said no. Given that climate, it is no surprise that just a few months later, the United States refused to let the St. Louis dock in our country, sending 908 Jewish refugees back to Europe, where many were murdered by the Nazis. That episode was a stain on this country's character and represented a tragic decision made in a political climate of fear, suspicion, and anti-Semitism. In 1939, our country could not tell the difference between the enemy and the victim of the enemy's terror and violence. Politicians and fearmongers claimed that Jews would threaten the security and stability of the United States by bringing communist ideas with them, or that Nazis would somehow slip into the country, pretending to be legitimate refugees. No, the risk of taking in Jewish refugees, even children, was too great. How shameful it would be to make that same mistake again today with Syrians who are trying to flee the horrors of that country. This coming Monday, we will be celebrating Martin Luther King Day. In one of his famous lectures in 1967, King stated, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Let us heed his words and raise our voices as loudly and as clearly as we can in support of those who have no voice in our political arena and who are looking to us for protection and support. As Americans and as Jews, we can do no less.